office, we had one person doing what ended up being a 5-day water fast. Couple people that were doing like their own variations, a lot of more time restricted eating, which we'll get into, and one of our staff doing a fasting mimicking diet. So in talking with you, it seemed like, well, this would be a great thing to really write about for our community. So you've been doing that now for us and just finished part 4.
Yeah, it's I think it's really timely. I think it's also really anybody who's interested in biohacking, it's just such an easy win. As far as, it's a habit where you're trying to do less rather than doing more. So I think it's a great first place to start. And, I'm excited to help anyone dip their toes in as they need.
Great. So what we want to do in the next half hour is start off and just do a little background about calorie restriction, because that's what's been the impetus to really bring attention to a lot of these fasting behaviors, but then really focus on a couple core fasting behaviors, tell you what they are, how they might benefit you, and how to get started. So I'm going to lead off with calorie restriction. And so one of the key things, and this goes back decades and decades, is that they found in all kinds of organisms, from literally fruit flies to rhesus monkeys at this point, that if you restrict their calories, good things tend to happen for the group as a whole. And that group as a whole, I think, is important to point out, because one of the things that comes out of calorie restriction research is there can be some individuals within the group that actually die prematurely, right? And then there's also downsides, like, it's really hard to live the rest of your life being hungry, as an example. If you're trying to perform at a high level cognitively, that can be really tough when your bandwidth is being consumed by thoughts about food and eating. So one of the things that's emerged is calorie restriction for a population tends to be good. It activates these cellular and mitochondrial programs that, as a result, tend to stress-proof us to a degree. And one of the positive side effects is healthier aging, and in some cases, a longer lifespan. But there are downsides to it. So these behaviors, we'll lump them in a big category of intermittent fasting, since that's a bucket you hear a lot in the biohacker space, but we'll be more specific about that. The goal of a lot of these is to gain the upside without having to punish yourself with the downside. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you for a second and just give your thoughts about maybe the big picture calorie restriction.
Yeah, I think from a big perspective, what stands out the most to me is how valuable the science can be in terms of showing, not just with rhesus monkeys, but with all these different animal models and yeast and things like that, how valuable it can be. And then even specifically the mechanisms that can be helpful for humans. But what I find so interesting is this kind of disparity between the science, which is super valuable, and then the application, which requires a little bit more finesse, so that the day-to-day user can utilize these techniques and really see some value from them. So it's funny, the first caloric restriction that we talk about in most of the scientific literature, if it's 15 to 40% reduction in calories for essentially for an extended period, the rest of the life.
Yeah, that's what they've been doing with the monkeys.
Right. And there's something about that consistency that, even subjectively, without looking at any data, seems unappealing to me. But there is data from, the Minnesota starvation experiment suggesting that if people tried to implement directly from the caloric restriction data, they're probably going to see some major downsides, including, inability to really focus and concentrate on tasks at hand. So it leaves much to be desired, the straight caloric restriction mentality.
And I think one of the things that's come out of some of the animal research is this idea that the animals that start with the most body fat and are able to maintain more body fat, actually the ones that gain their survival advantage, which that's not how it tends to be applied, right? Like the studies you just mentioned, Biosphere 2, Minnesota starvation experiment, they ended up being super lean. So if we were to jump from the animal research to humans, which is always a stretch, but it could mean that they wouldn't have been great candidates to do that in an ongoing manner anyways, if they're trying to get the life extension benefits. The other thing I think that's interesting that's come out of, especially a lot of the animal research, is that, so there's this idea of calorie restriction, but part of the context is these are nutritionally adequate diets. So they make sure they get enough vitamins, minerals, things like that. And they're not just the normal diet diluted, they're diets that tend to be much lower in protein. So one of the things that's come out of this research is that it could be protein that's triggering some of these things, and that reducing that substantially, which we'll get to when we talk more about the fasting mimicking diet, gives you a lot of the benefits without having to endure the calorie restriction as well.
Yeah, with the existing human research, which is somewhat, there's no results from the data yet, but there are people who have collectively decided that they're going to do this type of caloric restriction, and the acronym they go by is CRON, and I forget the exact nomenclature, but it's like calorie restriction, but they're maintaining the correct nutritional value, so the right amount of vitamins, minerals, etc. So the people who are doing this type of traditional caloric restriction seem to be very focused on getting the right amount of vitamins and micronutrients. Right.
Yeah, so it's important, if you're going to go that route, that you have those things covered. But what we're advocating is a different path. That's, at this point, seems like it gets a lot of the same benefits. And the key benefits, I'll list a few off and then kick it to you for a few others. But one of the things is there's basically two main principles or theories of aging. One would be this idea of programmed aging, and that is that as we get older, our cells start to almost run different software program. And because of that, we experience a lot of what we would think of as aging. The other theory would be aging as damage accumulation, which is this idea that our cells and mitochondria, which are organelles inside cells, over time accumulate damaged components, and that accumulates as we get older. So we have a larger quantity of less functional cells and mitochondria. And one of the things that's come out of it, initially the studies on calorie restriction, but now more and more on fasting or these strategies, is that these types of biohacks can actually counter aspects of both of those, both this aging as like a program and damage accumulation.
Yeah, so there's these aging components that you're speaking about, and I think we'll probably go into a few more of the mechanisms and things like that on a later Facebook Live. But some of the benefits outside of the aging sphere that I think are most applicable, or that, let's put it this way, that seem to be the easiest foot in the door, are really some of the weight management benefits that seem to be pretty evident from different fasting mechanisms, and then some of the short-term cognitive enhancement benefits that there's some literature to suggest that there's validity with these cognitive enhancements, but then also lots and lots of subjective experiences within the community as well. And so there's this kind of combination of the short-term benefits that are pretty immediate, lots of anecdotal and experiential reports on weight management, cognitive enhancement, including my own experiences. And then you have this really compelling research and theoretical benefit in the aging and life and health span, side, which I think makes it really appealing to, just as an aside, anyone who has that kind of optimization mentality. It's like, whoa, there's short-term benefits I'll experience now, and theoretically long-term benefits as well. So
yeah. Great. Well, I think that's a perfect segue now to move into some of these non-calorie restriction types of what I would think of as more fasting related behaviors. And By fasting, we're really talking about some duration of time where there's no calories coming in. So what we see in the biohacking space is the term intermittent fasting used fairly routinely, but it's a non-specific term. So there's, what I think of is it's a category of behaviors that someone might select from, but within that category, there's certain things that have been more and less studied. So we'll start with one that's been pretty fairly studied in both humans and animals, and that's called time-restricted eating. You'll sometimes, if you wanted to look it up on PubMed, the medical database, time-restricted feeding is the acronym you would use when you do it to animals, time-restricted eating when we as humans are choosing to do it. So I know you've got a lot of experience with time-restricted eating, as I do, so I'll let you tell our audience a little bit more about what it is.
Yeah, so I mean, to boil it down, time-restricted eating is, having an entire daily allowance of food into a shorter period of time. So, excuse me, a lot of the scientific literature has basically what's called feeding windows, so time during a day where the animals or humans are eating, which is anywhere between 4 to 12 hours in the day. And then there's times where there is a kind of a fasting window. And I'm specific with those numbers, 4 to 12 hours, because they differ a little bit from what is applied in the biohacking communities, which is, biohackers tend to try and make it a little bit more strict than you see in some of the scientific literature on time-restricted eating. So usually biohackers are looking for a feeding window of anywhere between 1 to 8 hours in a day or so. And so there's a lot of, as we'll go on with some of the other types of fasting methods, there's a lot of differences physiologically, but the time-restricted eating really is one of the easiest ways for people to kind of dip their toes into fasting. And this for a number of reasons, one of which is the reason I call it an easy win is because people can eat the same number of calories in a day, however, have different physiological responses by eating those calories in a smaller window of time. And so I think what I notice in the biohacking community is time-restricted eating has a lot of popularity in beginners, but then also specifically in people who are very compelled towards metabolic and weight management.
Yep. Well, and I think one of the things that came out of, if we go back to calorie restriction, for an example, in animals, one of the things they found is that when you calorie restrict an animal, usually the control is what's called ad libitum. So they would put a lot of chow out and let say in this case, a mouse eat it whenever they would like. When you calorie restrict an animal, they naturally are hungry, so they consume all that food almost immediately. So they naturally go to this time-restricted eating approach, and it's been really hard to tease out in calorie restriction research what amount of the benefits come from simply eating in a smaller window versus eating the lower amount of calories. So there's certainly been substantial evidence in animals and a growing amount in humans that there are metabolic benefits that occur fairly quickly. These can be things like blood sugar improvement in weight, things like that, by following this type of time-restricted eating. And I know going back to, I was an officer in the Navy in my other life back in the 80s. And at one point I was on basically a base where we had to eat in a cafeteria. So the options were to be there for breakfast, be there for lunch, be there for dinner. Dinner was over by 5, and then there was no food again until the next morning at 6:30 or whenever it opened. So during that month of what was somewhat like a forced time-restricted eating protocol was the leanest I ever was in the Navy. And I think a lot of people experience that, especially with what I tend to think of as early time-restricted eating, which is you're eating your calories more crunched in the daylight hours of the day. Conversely, if you're trying to improve metabolic health and deciding, okay, I'm going to do a 4-hour window, but do it from 8 at night till I go to bed at midnight, that might be a little bit more dubious of an experiment. It's certainly in animals, it wouldn't be as metabolically beneficial.
Yeah,
later.
It's really interesting to see, again, that kind of dichotomy between scientific literature and application. And so, like you said, there's some really compelling evidence around the time frame in which that time restriction is incorporated within the diets for the animals. So certain time restricted eating where the monkeys are eating in the morning seems to have a different effect than if the monkeys are eating the same amount of hours but in the evening. And so there's definitely this mechanism with regard to our circadian rhythm that's at play here that is still being teased out in the literature. And then, you look at humans, and when we tend to be social and when we tend to eat with friends and things like that, it's typically in the evening. And so it's kind of interesting because I mean, this is just a shoot in the dark, but I'd say anywhere between 70 to 80% of the people who are doing the time restricted eating, traditional like intermittent fasting, as they call it, they're probably eating afternoon to 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. or some window therein instead of eating in the morning, because it's just socially more acceptable to skip breakfast. And if you're going to eat a little bit later in the day. So it is, for people who want to go by the book, the time restricted eating earlier in the day could be really effective. And something and time restricted eating, as you had in the Navy, will probably it'll work. But one example that I give is my mother, who loves her breakfast, and she just tries to eat dinner earlier in the day so that she can still maintain a time restricted eating window. But relatively frequently, it doesn't end up that way because she has dinner late, because she has other responsibilities with my sisters or what have you. And so sometimes it's like I and many others say that the best fasting regimen is probably the one that you stick to with some regularity.
Good. We actually got a question in, so I'm going to jump to that in a second. Sure. But I would agree. So the core thing is that you're able to integrate something sustainably into your life. And so if you're going to do, the more what you suggested and what might work better for your mom, it's still important to create as much of a window as you can, more nights than not, before going to bed. So the question that we have come in is, does fasting mean not drinking either? Should you still be drinking water? So by fasting, it's usually thought of as a water fast would be the traditional way of fasting. So absolutely, you're encouraged to drink water, and oftentimes drinking non-caloric beverages, so herbal teas, coffee without any sweeteners or cream, would all be considered part of like fast. So really, by fasting, I think the way I would tend to interpret it, the most general definition would be something along the lines of not eating or consuming calories, but non-caloric things would be fine. Though I would say non-caloric sweeteners, from my perspective, would fall outside of being fasting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scientific literature to suggest the caloric sweeteners can do some really interesting things with confusing the way that our body metabolizes the next batch of sugars that come in and things like that. I would tend to agree and definitely want to promote drinking plenty of water when you are doing extended fasts, and be mindful not to drink too much water on extended fasts, because there are cases where by drinking an abundance of water, it flushes out a lot of minerals quickly, which can cause some problems. So I don't have offhand the exact amount of water that you'd want to maintain, but I think drinking 2 to 3 liters a day, even on an extended fast, should be enough to maintain hydration, but without going overboard.
Yep. So we got one other question that came in, and it says, what are your thoughts on caffeine intake? So I think, so one of the, we just kind of mentioned it with fasting in general. So caffeine, so drinking coffee or tea in the context of a water fast would generally be thought to not be something that would break a fast. And I know when you were writing one of the blogs for us, you mentioned a study that in animals that were given either decaffeinated or caffeinated coffee, it actually, for a window of time after, promoted autophagy and some of these beneficial aspects we usually attribute to fasting. And it seemed to be independent of the caffeine content. So caffeine didn't add to it, but there was certainly nothing that adding coffee into their fasting regime did negatively.
Yeah, that's where I would definitely clarify the coffee versus the caffeine aspect. So for many people, again, this comes down to compliance to some degree. If you drink coffee, there are the what in that study they suspect it was the polyphenols that provided the added benefit for autophagy. And there's also an appetite suppressing effect that can be really effective if you're doing a fast as well, especially for people who are new and just starting off. There's about, in my experience with time restricted eating, there's about 2 to 3 week period where the body's kind of acclimating to not receiving food in the time when it normally does. Basically, the circadian rhythm, certain hormones are essentially creating a hunger response because they're used to receiving food, and your body has to kind of outgrow that to some degree, for lack of a better term. And that takes about 2 to 3 weeks. And for me anyway, it did 2 to 3 weeks of, utilizing tea or coffee in that period can be really helpful for some people. Stick with it.
And so the other context I want to just mention to coffee quickly before we move on to these more periodic fasts would be in the context of time-restricted eating. So I tend to be much more of an early time-restricted eater. So I'll often be up by 6:30, go to the gym, have coffee, say 7:30-ish, come home, eat breakfast at 8:30, and then come into the office. So that idea of having coffee, I know is somewhat questionable whether it does or doesn't break the fast, and it's probably related more to, if you put a lot of sugar in it, a lot of cream, things like that. But in general, like my belief at this point is it's not like a huge thing. If you're not going to break your fast on time restricted eating, say till 11 or noon, and want to have a coffee at 9 in the morning, I wouldn't consider that a big deal. Certainly not something that's going to hugely derail your fast. It might incrementally, like as you put in the article, it's not an on-off switch. It's probably more of a spectrum. So it might not be ideal, but from a performance perspective, it may more than make up the difference.
Right. And I will say that from my own personal experience, I do use coffee in the same way that you've explained. I don't really consider it to be breaking a fast, but I do make an effort to do water-only extended fast, which we can talk about a little bit later, but where I have no coffee at all, just kind of like almost like a weird kind of purity perspective that I have on the fast.
Okay. But with that, I want to go directly now into what I would think of as more water fasts. And so to lead this off, I know that there's certain, I guess it depends what you're after. So in naturopathic medicine, one of the things that I learned, like going way back, 2.5 decades ago from some of the old timers at that point, was if someone had chronic digestive problems, sometimes something worth trying was to do 1-day water fasts. And the idea was, it was like fairly simplistic. Let's shut down the digestion for a day and kind of restart it better the next day. Now, fairly recently in preparing for this series, I did see an animal study where just a single day of a water fast in mice actually in the intestines generated intestinal stem cells. So within that 1 day, the digestive system already was regenerating. Now, for other cells, we probably want to go a lot longer, which brings us to what you've done a lot of, which are 3-day water fasts.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason that I'm such a big proponent of doing the extended fast is kind of how the metabolic machinery starts to change after an extended period of time without calories. And so, certain processes like, autophagy, which we were discussing earlier, can be modulated far more effectively within the 24-hour to 48-hour range, and mostly because it's the mechanisms that control autophagy and some of the other longevity benefits seem to be related to nutrient sensing, and that there's an extended period of time that's required for some of those mechanisms to kick in.
Right.
And the same is kind of true to some degree in terms of mental performance. So that kind of the mechanisms kind of takes care of some of the anti-aging bucket. And then if I'm looking at more of the short-term bucket, the changes with how our body is utilizing energy, going from certain mechanisms that are primarily glucose, sugar, dietary sugar based, to then, glycogen storage of sugar and things like that, and then finally into a more kind of fatty acid based expenditure and production of energy. And for me personally, there's a lot of subtle changes and differences that come from those extended fasts in terms of my performance, in terms of my mental state, and they kind of fall into those performance buckets that we had talked about earlier.
Okay, I just lost your voice there for a second. I'm not sure if other people did, but we did get a question that came in, and I think they're asking what is autophagy, and basically that's a scientific term that has to do. So what happens just as a natural part of our metabolism is especially protein components of our cells and mitochondria become damaged. And they lead to essentially dysfunctional units within our cells or dysfunctional mitochondria. And autophagy is the cleaning up mechanism. It's what our cellular process is to get rid of this damaged or dysfunctional units or debris. And the upside of that is we can then recycle those components into newer, younger, more functional versions. So when we say autophagy, really what we're talking about is regenerating younger versions of our cells and the powerhouses of our cells. Anything you want to add on that to just further that answer? Or
yeah, I think autophagy, I think you've explained it really well, and autophagy in my eyes is just such an important fundamental process that improves, arguably one of the most important aspects of our physiology in our cells, the mitochondria, our ability to produce energy more effectively, longer, et cetera. And I think, again, looking at the kind of the practical side of things, autophagy is a mechanism that would have in an ancestral, from an ancestral perspective, been far more common due to food scarcity. If you have to go hunt your own food, or you have to gather certain things from, wild foraged areas, more than likely there's a greater degree of autophagy that occurs. Whereas today in the West, for honestly anybody who's watching this Facebook Live, food is ubiquitous, and it's really easy to consistently be providing ourselves with calories, for other evolutionary mechanisms, whereas autophagy never really gets a chance to do its job when we have this kind of abundance of food. And so taking the conscious approach of encouraging autophagy is super valuable for us people who really don't have to worry about, finding ourselves in a starvation situation.
Yeah, so I guess wrapping up, so what's often thought of is there's hallmarks of aging. And we mentioned earlier leading into this that one of the main theories of aging is this idea of aging as damage accumulation. So what autophagy does is it actually counters that. It gets rid of a lot of this damage that's accumulated over time. And what ends up happening when our cells regenerate those units within it, they end up being healthier, more functional, and oftentimes, from a almost performance perspective, younger cells. So it's one of the core goals when you're thinking in terms of these fasting behaviors for like a health or longevity perspective. That's one of the main things you're after. So we have one more question that came in, and I know our time was supposed to be 30 minutes, and I'm not sure how long we can go over. So I'll maybe give us a few more minutes after we answer this question, and then we'll call it a wrap. But we will redo a part 2 to this in 2 weeks. So the question is, great stuff. What's your opinion on broccoli sprouts and sulforaphane? So I would say, like, the big picture, if we go back to calorie restriction as an example, there's obviously the lifespan things we mentioned as one of the core benefits. Healthy aging. So, these monkeys that have been long-term calorie restricted, their fur looks better, they're less overweight, lots of what I would think of as metabolic health benefits. But one of the other benefits of long-term calorie restriction has been anti-cancer benefits. So fewer animals get cancer and far fewer die of cancer. And that's where sulforaphane really plugs into that aspect of calorie restriction signaling. So one of the things that calorie restriction upregulates is this pathway called NRF2. It's not super important that you'll lock onto that, but when that gets upregulated, it really dampens a lot of the chronic immune problems that we have and upregulates all types of what I would think of as defense mechanisms. So that's the pathway that really leads to the anti-cancer benefits of calorie restriction. And sulforaphane, which is a compound from broccoli, activates that on its own. So that's where it kind of plugs into this picture. So I'm a big fan.
Yes, I agree, and glad you could more eloquently articulate the NRF2 equation. Just as an add-on again for the people who are taking it from the anti-cancer perspective, I think there's value there kind of on a longer term scale. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but there's some antioxidant value of NRF2 just in and of itself almost. And I think that's really cool short term.
Yeah, our antioxidant defenses are also upregulated by that pathway.
Right, yeah.
I think of it as the cell protective mechanisms. Really, that's the main. You mentioned different pathways in part 3 of your series, but the NRF2 is the one that does a lot of the defense mechanisms. So detoxification would be another one.
Right, and I will say that, again, from a purely application perspective for people, there is a specific. So I've done 23andMe genetic tests, and although I think that they're in their early stages and kind of rudimentary, does provide some interesting information. And kind of I've used the 23andMe data to plug in with some other platforms to get some more in-depth analysis, and I've found that I tend to be, according to the data, a poor detoxifier. So I have some specific pathways that are getting clogged up, to simplify it, and sulforaphane is a really effective tool that can be used for me specifically, at least on a theoretical level, for detoxification. And so I've been using it regularly for a while, especially since I've known about that potential genetic pathway. So for anybody who's interested and already has 23andMe data, that could be something to apply as well.
Great. Well, I think I want to just bring it to a wrap up for this first section. So one of the things we didn't get to, but we'll get to on 2 weeks from now, is something called fasting mimicking diet. So I was just at A4M, which is a huge anti-aging medical conference, particularly for doctors and other health professionals. And I would say one of the things that kept coming up in different presentations over the course of those 3 days was something called the fasting mimicking diet, which is a way to get a lot of these benefits we've been speaking about without having to actually do a water fast. So we're going to cover that in a lot more detail 2 weeks from now. We'll also be covering things like the last question that just came in was about breaking a fast. So we'll cover that in part 2, as well as additional questions that come up. So this has been a great kickoff, and it's been wonderful to have you on here with me.
Absolutely, yeah. Good to chat, and glad we had some good engagement, interaction, and hope to answer some more questions.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll be with you live 2 weeks from now.
Alrighty, take care, guys.